Some leaders fade from memory, but others, they leave behind a set of ideas so sharp, so clear, and yet so controversial that they just keep shaping debates long after they're gone. Today, we're diving into the mind of one of those figures, Singapore's founding leader, Lee Kuan Yew.
I mean, it's been over a decade since he passed away, but his name comes up all the time when people talk about government, about global politics, about just plain national survival. So why is that? What is it about his worldview that feels so incredibly relevant, maybe even essential right now?
And there's a reason we're talking about this today. Today marks the 11th anniversary of his passing. It's a day when a lot of people in Singapore kind of pause and reflect on what they call the Singapore story. That unbelievable journey from a tiny island with absolutely nothing to a major global hub. And this isn't just about some stuffy official ceremonies. This legacy is alive and well. You see people holding tributes at important places, planting trees to honor his famous Garden City vision, his big idea to make the city a lush green space, and social media just explodes with his most memorable quotes. It's a real grassroots kind of thing. But here's what's really interesting, the official theme. The focus isn't just on looking back. It's about action. It's about taking his core principles like multiracialism, meritocracy, and self-reliance and actually using them to solve today's problems. Which, of course, leads to the big question, what exactly were the principles of his philosophy? Well, let's start right here. This is probably his most famous quote, and man, it just perfectly captures the relentless, absolute force of his commitment. This wasn't a job for him. He saw the survival of Singapore as his personal, lifelong, all-consuming mission. The heart of his entire way of thinking can be boiled down to two words: hard-headed pragmaticism. This was never about left-wing or right-wing ideology. It was a philosophy totally laser-focused on one single question: what works? It was all about practical results, stability, and national survival above everything else.
And this quote, wow, it shows you just how unsentimental that pragmatism could get. He knew that to lead, especially in a small, vulnerable country, you had to make tough calls that people wouldn't always like. For him, being effective was way, way more important than being popular.
So you have to understand the why behind this really tough approach. He said over and over that for a tiny island, a place with no natural resources, your only real asset is your people and your government. So, in his mind, if the government was weak or corrupt, Singapore was, and he used this word, finished.
Okay, and this is where we get to the really controversial stuff. I mean, from campaigns on how many kids families should have to banning chewing gum, he was famous for what a lot of people called social engineering. But just look at his justification. It's pure pragmatism. He didn't see these things as meddling. He saw them as absolutely necessary for survival.
All right, so let's take this mindset, this cold, practical, what works lens, and let's apply it. How would a mind like Lee Kuan Yew's look at a massive crisis dominating the headlines today, like the conflict in Iran?
Well, his view on Iran wasn't static at all. In fact, it did a complete 180, and the turning point was the 1979 revolution. Before that, under the Shah, he saw Iran as a practical partner, a force for stability. But after '79, he saw the new regime as a Pandora's box, unleashing a dangerous ideology on the world.
I mean, the shift was just night and day. Before 1979, Iran helped keep the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, which is absolutely vital for a trading nation like Singapore. After 1979, it became a source of militant ideology that he was terrified could spread and destabilize his own part of the world. His view went from opportunity to threat.
Now that might sound shockingly blunt, right? A distraction, but to get what he meant, you have to understand his priorities. He wasn't saying the conflicts didn't matter, but he saw them as a sideshow to a much, much bigger shift happening on the world stage.
And this was that shift. He was convinced that the real defining story of our time wasn't the chaos in the Middle East. It was the historic, unstoppable economic rise of China and India. He saw Iran as just one piece on a giant chessboard where the main game was between the US and a rising China.
So, if he were looking at today's headlines, his pragmatic mind would cut through all the noise and boil it down to two critical questions. First, the economic choke point. Is the Strait of Hormuz open? Is trade flowing? And second, the rational actor problem. Is the leadership acting based on ideology, which he deeply mistrusted, or is it acting on pure survivalist pragmatism?
But look, it wasn't all just cold, hard geopolitics. This pragmatic lens shaped how he saw pretty much everything, and sometimes in really surprising and frankly unforgettable ways.
This is one of my favorite examples. He called the air conditioner the greatest invention of the century. And why? Not for comfort. It was because he believed it leveled the economic playing field. It allowed people in hot, tropical places like Singapore to be just as productive as people in cooler climates. That is pure, unadulterated pragmatism.
And he brought that same logic to nation building. He famously said that in the early days, Singapore needed engineers, the people who could literally build the country, way more than it needed poets. Now, it wasn't that he disliked art, but it was a crystal clear statement of his priorities. You have to focus relentlessly on what it takes to build a nation from scratch.
But it's so important to end on this note, because for all the tough talk about harsh realities and survival, his final message wasn't about fear at all. It was about ambition. This quote, "Follow that rainbow, go write it," was his challenge to the next generation to be bold, to dream big. It showed that all that pragmatism was really about building a foundation for a better future.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. When you look at the world today, with its endless stream of crises, you have to wonder, is this kind of unsentimental, hard-headed pragmatism just an unpleasant necessity? Or maybe, just maybe, is it the only realistic way for a nation to actually survive and thrive?